everyone. Good morning. So I'm glad that the polling worked. There's a few of the questions in that are actually quite relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. So here we have a snapshot of the coast of Louisiana. Very stylized, very pretty. This is a coastline that didn't look like this 50 years ago and isn't going to look like this 50 years from now. One thing I want you to note is, and I'm going to show you a series of slides coming up, is that we have 4 stars. This is Lafayette, approximately, Baton Rouge, Houma, and New Orleans. So this is a coast that has been modified over time. And on this slide, you can see that there's a lot of red here. These represent levees, either levees along the river or levees that surround communities for hurricane protection. So 8,000 years ago, this is what the coastline looked like. It's very different. But we have the 41% of the US is drained by the Mississippi River, and over time, land was built. So the sediment coming from as far north as Canada and water coming, from Minnesota all came down and was dumped into the Gulf of Mexico, leaving behind thousands of acres of wetlands. And over time, the river would find a more efficient route to the Gulf and start to move. So kind of like a fire hose, the river moved back and forth across the coast and built South Louisiana and the Mississippi River Delta. Now, one thing you might note from here is that we have a lot of channels that branch off of here. Well, we talk about the Mississippi River. It's the Mississippi River, and it's also distributary channels that branch off the river that help distribute that flow. But this isn't what the system looks like today. This is what it looks like today. So how did we get here? So when the Europeans first arrived in this area, they found an area that was rich, teeming with life, buffalo, rich soils for growing, and they wanted to live here. They wanted to make their lives here. But they also ran into a problem. They had this mighty Mississippi River that would overflow its banks from time to time and destroy all their hard work. So pretty quickly, pretty much as soon as the European settlers started coming in, they started building levees along the river. And in fact, it was kind of a requirement if you were given land by the King of France to build these river levees. So very soon, levees stretched all the way up to Baton Rouge. But they weren't really good levees. They were pretty bad at making the levees because there was no consistency. It was up to the individual landowner to make a levee, and so the river broke through those levees pretty frequently. And over here, what we have is a map showing all the places the river broke through during a certain period of time. So these things called crevasses, when the river was high, the water would find a weak spot in the levee and go through. Now, one of the last ones that actually had a big impact in New Orleans was called, I'm just going to pronounce it Sauvé, I don't know if that's quite right, the Sauvé's crevasse. And this was a sugar plantation in Jefferson Parish. The river broke through the levee during a high flow, and it flooded all the way down to Canal Street. So this is a painting depicting the flooding on Canal Street from that crevasse. But we got a little smarter, we got a little wiser. How are we going to live with the river? How are we going to manage this better? And the federal government stepped in and started having standards for levees. And that was all well and good until the 1927 flood, and that really highlighted that this idea of levees only as a way to manage the river was not going to work for the long term. So what we have here, this is a map, and everything you see that's shaded, that's what flooded during the 1927 flood. So lots of the area flooded, and it was pretty widespread. We have Little Rock, Arkansas, where a bridge was washed out. Greenville, Mississippi. Morgan City, Louisiana. And you'll notice right here around New Orleans, there isn't flooding, but there is south of New Orleans. So that's because they blew the levee at Carnarvon, just below New Orleans. This was done because the waters were getting higher and higher in New Orleans. People started to panic, and they pressured, and pressure was put to blow the levees to relieve the pressure against the New Orleans levees. So that area was blown up, and it did displace a lot of people. Overall, the 1927 flood killed 500 people, destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, and displaced more than 1 million people. This was a devastating flood of record for our country and really drove home the point that we actually have to think about the river in a different way. So from that comes what's called the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project. The Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to come up with a way to manage the river better. We had a levees-only policy up until this point, and this kind of changes the game. So it does have levees, improved levees, improved flood walls, bigger, better levees. It also has channel improvements and stabilizations, those rock revetments along the levees, cutting off some of the bends in the river that helped navigation continue on. Then you also have tributary basin improvements, putting in reservoirs that can hold back floodwaters so they can control when floods come down a little bit better. And then finally, building in floodways, allowing places where water can have a relief, have that where we blew the levee at Carnarvon before, actually building something in place where you can have that relief from the floodwaters. And in terms of floodways, there are 4 major ones as part of the MR&T, and 3 of them are in Louisiana. There's one up here just south of Cairo, Illinois, called the Bird Point or New Madrid floodway. Then there's the Atchafalaya, Morganza, and then of course there's the Bonnie Carey spillway, which was operated this year in order to alleviate flood pressure on the levees for New Orleans. But the MR&T system also had another consequence. When we put up all these levees, when we tried to manage the flow, we cut off a lot of where the sediment and freshwater once went. We cut off all those distributary channels. There are barely any distributary channels for the river anymore. And in fact, the only major one left is the Atchafalaya River. And oh, that's right, I overthought myself. Sometimes I am clever. Put little circles around things so I don't have to use the pointer. So we have, you can see where brown plumes of sediment are coming out. This is from the 2011 flood, which was a big flood on the river that was managed very successfully. It was a very big flood, and the Corps did a good job of managing this flood. They did actually use the Morganza spillway, and as you can see from this image, they used the Bonnie Carey spillway as well. So you have a lot of sediment coming out of the river, and a lot of it is going into the Gulf, not going into the places where it's most needed. So there's also lots of other changes that we've done to the system. We have a great ability to come in and modify our environment to our own liking, and sometimes it has unintended consequences. And some of these things are just natural consequence of where we live and the other processes that are happening. You have things like sea level rise. Sea levels are rising. Dams upriver, particularly along the Missouri, have decreased the amount of sediment that actually makes its way down to Louisiana. You have the introduction of invasive species, things like nutria or some of the feral hogs that will tear up the marsh itself. You have subsidence. The geology of Louisiana is one where we are sinking, whether that's happening in the deep, deep geology or that's happening at the surface, because we have wet, muddy sediment on top of wet, muddy sediment, and it squeezes out over time and we sink. You also have oil and gas infrastructure that have been carved through the wetlands that have changed and disrupted how salt and fresh water flow through the system. Navigation channels like the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which was dredged in the 50s and 60s as a shortcut from the Gulf of Mexico to the Port of New Orleans. It was not really heavily used, but it did help serve as a saltwater superhighway up into the freshwater wetlands along the eastern flank of the city. And that's the vulnerable flank of the city as exposed in Hurricane Katrina. Then you also have oil spills, large man-made oil spills that can smother the marsh vegetation and impact the organisms that live there. And then, of course, you have hurricanes. Hurricanes which shape our communities, change where people live, change how people live within the coast. So all of these things together have had a result: widespread land loss across Louisiana. And from our quiz, how many square miles have we lost? Yep, we lost nearly 2,000 square miles. That's 5,000 square kilometers if you like metric. So, and I just had this pointed out to me last night. If you are red-green colorblind, all of this is red. There's only green here and here. So, just a note. In the future, I'll have to remember that. So we've had a lot of land loss. And what has that land loss meant? It means that the estuaries that are some of our most productive environments are changing. You're losing the land that is habitat for a lot of organisms. You also have salt water moving into freshwater systems, changing who and what can live there. And an estuary is defined by a mix of fresh and salt water. It's an environment where fresh and salt water mix. You have a gradient of salinities from freshwater to saltwater, where organisms can come in and find the perfect place for them to not only survive but thrive. Everyone can find where it is they need to be and where their predators aren't. So estuaries are kind of the backbone for productivity in the Gulf of Mexico. Widespread land loss has meant a lot for communities as well. I'm going to just zoom in here on New Orleans. You can see we've had a lot of land loss along that eastern flank of New Orleans. It wasn't that long ago where the Gulf of Mexico was pretty far from New Orleans. Every day it gets a little bit closer. And that point was driven home during Hurricane Katrina, when that eastern flank of the city was exposed and we had widespread flooding in the city. And what we can actually see, if we look, this is a map of flooding in Katrina going from 0.2 feet up to, I think, 15 feet. You can actually see a reflection of how this system or how this area was built. You have the sliver along the river here, which is the natural river levee. It's the high ground of the city. It's where we are right now. You also see some high ground spots here, and these are old bayous, Bayou Gentilly and Bayou Metairie. So again, the high ground. And then you have a lot of areas that are below sea level now. A lot of this was swampland that's been drained. And so that is where the water accumulated during Hurricane Katrina. So the coast has changed, and a lot of places, when they talk about their coastlines, they'll talk about how change is coming. Things are going to change. Here in Louisiana, change has been happening for a very long time. And it isn't going to stop. It's going to continue to change. So I'm just going to give you a preview of this. I think I might show this map 1 or 2 times. But this could be what our future looks like if we don't do restoration. And again, everything in red is loss and everything in green is gain. So it's a future defined by loss. And this is a scary future, and it's a future that I think doesn't help any of us. So what can we do? Well, first, we need to start thinking about our coast in a different way. And this was really something I think the 2005 hurricane season made a good point of. We can't just think of levees. We can't put our faith in levees alone. They're not enough. Levees can fail, and then we're trapped in a city filled with water. We actually have to think about how all the pieces we have at our disposal can work together for a better, more sustainable future. And that means non-structural adaptation. This is things like elevating homes, flood-proofing businesses. You can live in the areas where the elevation is lower, but you're gonna have to think about, how do I get above the base flood elevation? How do I protect my home better? We also do have things like structural protection, levees, elevated roads. How do we protect our communities? How do we get access to the things that we need to get access to? But it's also about integrating environmental restoration. Having a strong and healthy coastline in front of those levees is really important. Those natural environments, the bare islands, intact marshes, can help slow that storm surge down before it even gets to our levees. So having all these things together will create a better, more resilient future for our coastal communities. So this could be our future if we do nothing. Now, we can just let that happen. We can just let nature do what it's going to do and see what we're dealt, or we can be proactive and we can decide that we have some power in our future and we can do something to change this. And the state of Louisiana has decided, yes, we do have the power to change this. We have to be smart about it, though. We don't have all the money in the world, and we're not going to get all the money in the world. So we have to take whatever dollars we can get and invest it in the best way possible. And the state has done this by going through a coastal master plan process to understand how we build a better coast for Louisiana, for our communities, for the organisms that live here, the places that we like to hunt and fish. And this is kind of the embodiment or the backbone of the master plan. This is what we've decided. Here's how we think we should spend our money moving forward. Here's what coastal restoration looks like in Louisiana. And this is cutting edge. Other places don't have this. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, they looked towards Louisiana and said, oh, that's a good idea. We should start doing that as well. So it's one of the things that I think Louisiana should be proud of, that we're a little bit ahead of the game, and now we just have to implement it. And Brent is actually going to talk a little bit more about the coastal master plan process and how we got to this level that we are here.
We have some questions. If we have any questions, got a minute for questions. We got plenty of time. We've got some 5 minutes for questions. Then we're going to have a video, and then we're going to bring up the one and only Brent Haas.
All right, I jumped it, I guess. Yeah. I think it's something, there's been a few studies that have tried to look at it, but I don't know. I've never tried to look at all of the data to see, can you actually zero in on like how much any one thing contributed to land loss. I think that's a complicated thing. It may be there, but I don't know the data enough to know that. Mm-hmm.
Has there been any research associated? Has there been any research associated with the possibility of taking the river water and putting it back into any of the original remaining tributaries, particularly like Bayou Lafourche, Bayou Terrebonne, Bayou Penchant, and all of those? I think almost all of them are in historic rivers, but they're all no longer flowing because we don't get the water anymore.
Yeah, there's actually a project that will is looking to increase the flow in Bayou Lafourche. They are trying to put more water back in it. It is something that is being looked at and has been explored a little bit more. I think, having that natural distributary network and using that to our advantage is a good way to go about it. In terms of like putting the sediment and water back into the area in general, there are some restoration projects that are being looked at and have a lot of science behind them that have been presented on sediment diversions and freshwater diversions. Some of them use the old distributary channels, but some of them are creating a new channel to kind of reconnect the river with those wetland areas. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you going to talk about that at all? Okay. So I'll just answer real quick. So in general, the coastal master plan process, they update the plan every 5 years, and they will try and use the latest science. So they do try to use, when they start the process, the most up-to-date predictions of what sea level rise is going to look like. And so that is a variable that changes over time, and it is one of the reasons why the master plan is a living document that gets updated. Our conditions change, whether we have hurricanes, the rate of sea level rise changes, and so we have to be somewhat flexible and adaptable in that. So they do try and actually take that into account. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. So what is it?
To what extent is the old science that existed in the indigenous communities? Mm-hmm. To what extent is that being factored in?
That I don't know.
Here, let's...
Okay.
I'm sorry. I asked, to what extent is the science that existed in indigenous peoples who were here first, to what extent is that being factored in to the new plan, the new technologies?
Yeah. Yeah, traditional ecological knowledge. Yeah. I think it's something that we are trying to figure out as we move forward, and I think that's a good question, and I don't know the full extent of it, but that's a very good question. Okay.
I can help.
Okay.
So I'm Brent Hawes. I'm with CPRA, and we have had a pilot program to incorporate something called SciTech, traditional ecological knowledge, which is exactly what you're talking about, into the evaluation tools that we use to look at projects and in the future of the coast as well. So to that extent, now it's been small scale, it's not been very wide scale, but we certainly recognize that as a valuable knowledge base and something that we need to incorporate into our work and what's going to occur in the future along our coast. So we hope to expand that and certainly incorporate more of that tech into what we're doing. Absolutely.